If there was ever a kingdom that seemed to stand with one foot in history and the other in memory, it was Dilmun. It rose where the sea should have been merciless, where heat should have scorched ambition into silence, and yet where fresh water shimmered beneath the earth and, in places, even rose through the salt itself. To the great cities of Mesopotamia, this was not merely another island on a distant horizon. It was a place spoken of with wonder, a place of merchants, of sanctuaries, of graves too numerous to ignore, and of harbors that gathered the wealth of worlds which, by all logic, should never have met. Long before empires traced their pride in stone from Rome to Persia, before the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean were bound into later commercial systems, Dilmun had already taught the ancient world a profound lesson that power does not always belong to the land that produces the treasure. Sometimes it belongs to the land that understands how to welcome it, weigh it, bless it, and send it onward. In the imagination of later ages, paradise is often imagined as remote, untouched, hidden from men. Dilmun was something more difficult and far more interesting. It was a paradise entangled with labor. It was a place where boats had to be built, where accounts had to be kept, where copper had to be unloaded and redistributed, where seals had to be pressed into clay, where rituals had to be performed, where rulers had to persuade traders, priests, sailors, and farmers that order could be maintained between desert and sea. It was a paradise that worked. That is why it mattered. That is why it endured in memory. And that is why, even now, across the Arabian Gulf, its story feels less like a vanished chapter than like a deep current, still moving beneath the surface of the present. To understand Dilmun, one must first strip away the habit of seeing the Gulf as a margin. For too long, older histories written from the standpoint of river empires or Mediterranean capitals imagined this region as a corridor, an interval, a body of water crossed on the way to somewhere supposedly greater. Yet the archaeology of Bahrain, the surrounding coasts of eastern Arabia, and the islands to the north tells a different story. The Gulf was not merely a passage. It was a stage on which entirely new forms of connection were invented. Here, seafaring linked riverine Mesopotamia with the copper lands of Magan in what is now the coastlines of Oman and the United Arab Emirates. Here, goods from the Indus world arrived not as abstractions, but as weight, color, scent, texture, and administrative challenge. Here, communities adapted themselves to tides, shoals, anchorages, and aquifers. Here, kingdoms could grow not because they were vast in territory, but because they were indispensable in function. Mesopotamian texts remembered Dilmun very early. Even when the details remained uncertain, the name itself carried unusual resonance. In practical records, it appeared as a commercial center, a point of transshipment between Sumer and lands farther east. In mythological compositions, it acquired another life altogether. Dilmun became associated with purity, brightness, and divine presence. This does not mean that the scribes of Mesopotamia were writing modern travel advertisements, nor should sacred literature be confused with a gazetteer, but it tells us something invaluable about perception. To people living in the mud brick cities of southern Mesopotamia, surrounded by river silt, political rivalry, and the constant demands of irrigation, a land in the Gulf associated with clean waters, maritime openness, and order could become more than a trading partner. It could become a mental geography of renewal. That is one reason the story of Dilmun cannot be reduced to cargo manifests. It belonged equally to economy and imagination. Archaeology gives that imagination a body. On Bahrain, the Great Tell of Khalat al-Bahrain preserves the remains of a city with a sequence of occupation stretching back to around the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era, with major building phases revealing walls, monumental structures, harbor functions, and continued strategic importance over centuries. The mound is not simply impressive because it is ancient. It is impressive because it is layered. Every layer is a decision made by human beings who believed this site remained worth building upon, defending, and reinterpreting. That continuity is one of the most eloquent signs of Dilmun's importance. Places of little consequence are abandoned cleanly. Places of consequence are rebuilt until their own ground becomes a monument. The rise of Dilmun was never the story of isolation. It emerged from a wider Bronze Age transformation in which river civilizations, oasis communities, coastal settlements, and island polities learned to participate in increasingly long-distance exchange. Mesopotamia hungered for raw materials. It did not possess in sufficient quantity copper, hard stone, exotic woods, precious or semi-precious stones, luxury objects, and specialized products from lands beyond its alluvial plain. To the south and southeast lay Magan, associated in Mesopotamian tradition with copper and maritime skill. Farther still lay Meluha, widely linked by scholars to the Indus civilization. Between these worlds, Dilmun occupied a position of extraordinary advantage. Bahrain was not the only inhabited place in the Gulf, nor the only harbor, but it became the most symbolically charged and archaeologically prominent heart of a system that joined them. One can picture the achievement in a series of concrete scenes. A vessel from the Indus region approaches with cargo and with men carrying habits of measurement and sealing shaped by another civilization. A local authority in Dilmun receives the goods, records them, and arranges onward movement. Copper from Magan arrives, perhaps already partially processed, perhaps still requiring management and redistribution. Agricultural products from Mesopotamia move in the opposite direction. Stones, beads, ceramics, and crafted items travel with them. Dates and local produce sustain crews and settlements. What looks from a distance like commerce becomes, at close range, a choreography of trust. Goods of great value cannot pass through an unstable harbor. They require mediators. They require recognition of weights, marks, customs, and obligations. In that sense, Dilmun's greatness lay not merely in what it possessed, but in the confidence others placed in its systems. This is where one of the most revealing pieces of evidence appears: the stamped seals associated with Dilmun, and found not only in Bahrain, but also in Mesopotamia and, more sporadically, in Iran and the Indus sphere. One British museum object, a so-called Gulf-type seal discovered at Ur, illuminates an entire world. The museum notes that around the turn of the late 3rd to early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, merchants from the Indus Valley seem to have settled in Dilmun, married into local families, and become deeply involved in local and long-distance maritime trade. Their seals reveal hybrid identity. The humped bull and traces of Indus script evoke Harappan traditions, yet the form itself shows adaptation, including influences from Iran and local conventions. Over time, some inscriptions became only pseudo-inscriptions, suggesting that the script retained prestige even when full literacy in its original tradition had faded. Few artifacts speak more movingly of how civilizations actually meet. They do not remain pure, they become each other's memory. So Dilmun was not a passive warehouse drifting in the wake of stronger powers. It was an active broker of cultural translation. Merchants did not merely pass through. Some settled, adapted, and helped create new local elites. Administrative technologies traveled with them. Weights, seals, habits of record keeping, and expectations of commercial verification became part of local life. That is why the image of Dilmun as paradise must be handled carefully. It was not paradise because it escaped complexity. It was paradise because it mastered complexity in an environment where such mastery was anything but guaranteed. The island's fresh groundwater, cultivable zones, fishing opportunities, and position along navigable routes made settlement possible. Human organization transformed that possibility into prosperity. The ecological basis of this achievement deserves particular attention because it is one of the keys to Dilmun's enduring mystique. Bahrain, whose very name in Arabic evokes the two seas, has long been associated with a remarkable conjunction of salt water and fresh water. Ancient and pre-modern observers alike were struck by the presence of sweet water in a maritime landscape. In the Bronze Age, such resources were not a romantic detail. They were destiny. Fresh water allowed communities to provision themselves, support agriculture, maintain date cultivation, and host transient populations such as sailors and traders. It offered relief in a region where water is always more than a resource. It is structure, hierarchy, diplomacy, and survival. When later memory linked Dilmun with a place of purity, one does not need to imagine naivety or fantasy. One needs only to imagine what it meant, in the ancient Gulf, to find enduring water where there should have been only thirst. This sacred dimension comes into even sharper focus at the temples of Barbar. There, successive temple structures, built one above another across centuries, speak of continuity in worship and of a deliberate effort to renew the bond between community and divinity. Bahraini cultural authorities and long-standing archaeological interpretation have connected these temples with the worship of Enki, the Mesopotamian god associated with wisdom and fresh water. Whether every ritual can be reconstructed is another matter, and honest history must accept the limits of certainty, but the setting itself is eloquent. Water, cult, and legitimacy converged. In a maritime kingdom whose prosperity depended upon reliable access to life-giving resources, the sacred could never be detached from the practical. The temple did not float above economic life. It sanctified the order on which economic life depended. If the temples reveal how Dilmun understood life, the burial mounds reveal how it understood death, ancestry, and social order. Across Bahrain, the landscape still bears the astonishing testimony of these cemeteries. The UNESCO listing for the Dilmun burial mounds describes a serial property of 21 archaeological areas, including vast fields of tumuli and royal mounds, with a combined total of around 11,774 burial mounds. Most belong to the early Dilmun period and were built across roughly 3 centuries, between about 2050 and 1750 before the Common Era. Numbers alone, however, do not explain their emotional force. One must imagine them not as isolated monuments but as a horizon of memory. For ancient inhabitants, these mounds were not an archaeological field. They were the silent city of the dead surrounding the lives of the living. Such landscapes do not arise by accident. They require labor, planning, and a society sufficiently stable to invest enormous resources in funerary architecture over generations. The mounds also reveal social differentiation. Some were modest. Others, especially the so-called royal mounds, were monumental, elaborate, and unmistakably expressive of hierarchy. This suggests that Dilmun's prosperity did not dissolve status, it sharpened it. International trade brought not only goods and prestige, but new forms of social complexity. Wealth had to be displayed, legitimized, and anchored in lineage. The dead became part of the political language of the living. To bury one's elite in visible, durable forms was to declare that power in Dilmun was not temporary brokerage. It had depth, it had ancestry, it had claims upon the future. There is also something profoundly moving in the architectural form of some of these graves. Archaeological study indicates that many mounds began as tower-like structures, with the grandest forming 2-storied sepulchral constructions of remarkable ambition. These were not hidden interments, they were statements. In a landscape where navigation mattered, visibility mattered too. Just as walls and harbors projected power to the living, mounds projected continuity to everyone who moved through the land. Dilmun thus organized its world vertically from the underworld of burial chambers, to the inhabited spaces of settlement and sanctuary, to the open sky under which ships arrived and departed. Death, trade, worship, and rule all belonged to a single spatial imagination. It is tempting, when speaking of Bronze Age prosperity, to imagine only elites and exchange. Yet Dilmun could not have functioned without ordinary routines repeated countless times. Fishermen knew channels and currents. Farmers tended plots sustained by precious water. Craftsmen cut stone, shaped seals, handled copper, and finished objects whose journey might carry them far beyond the horizon. Sailors waited for weather, loaded cargoes, repaired rigging, and judged the moods of the Gulf. Priests or ritual specialists oversaw ceremonies whose precise words may be lost, but whose social role was unmistakable. Children grew up in a world where foreign goods were not abstract luxuries but familiar presences, where strangers with other tongues and dress could be encountered in market and harbor, where the island's importance was experienced not as ideology but as daily rhythm. This human scale matters because it helps explain the durability of Dilmun's influence. When a society becomes a nodal point in international exchange, it does not merely collect wealth. It acquires habits of mediation, habits of adaptation, habits of recognizing value across cultural boundaries. Those habits can outlast particular dynasties. They can survive political reorganization. They can even survive the fading of a name. In this sense, Dilmun was training the Gulf for a historical role it would play again and again across later centuries, not as a passive recipient of external civilization, but as an active organizer of encounters between civilizations. The northern extension of Dilmun's world is especially revealing here. On Failaka Island, off the coast of Kuwait, archaeology has uncovered Bronze Age temples, administrative buildings, warehouses, and evidence of harbor activity tied to the Dilmun sphere. UNESCO's tentative listing for Failaka emphasizes the island's fresh groundwater, fertile conditions, and strategic location at the threshold of the Shatt al-Arab. This was not peripheral to Dilmun's story. It was part of the way Dilmun structured the Gulf. Bahrain did not stand alone like a jewel in empty water. It participated in a distributed network of island and coastal stations, each shaped by local resources but linked by shared commercial and cultural logic. The Gulf, in other words, was already a system. Dilmun was one of the first powers to understand how to inhabit it as such. Southward, the connection with Magan tied Dilmun to the copper-bearing landscapes of the Oman Peninsula and to the seafaring traditions of what is now Oman and the United Arab Emirates. This relationship is crucial, especially for viewers in the Emirates, because it reminds us that the Eastern Arabian littoral was not waiting passively for history to arrive from elsewhere. It was already contributing indispensable resources and skills to one of the earliest international maritime zones in the ancient world. Copper was more than a commodity. In the Bronze Age, it meant tools, weapons, status goods, and the material basis of civilizational expansion. When Mesopotamian texts speak of Magan and Dilmun together, they are preserving the memory of an Arabian participation in global exchange that was early, creative, and indispensable. To the northwest lay Mesopotamia, whose cities generated the textual memory through which Dilmun first entered modern scholarship. Yet the relationship was never one of simple dependence. Mesopotamia needed Dilmun, but Mesopotamia also imagined Dilmun. That duality created a special kind of prestige. A city can dominate its neighbor militarily and yet still envy what that neighbor symbolizes. The scribes of the rivers recorded taxes, shipments, and royal claims, but they also wrote myths in which places became moral or sacred landscapes. Dilmun's name, therefore, resonated in both archive and imagination. The kingdom occupied the practical roots of trade and the symbolic roots of literature. Few places manage such a double existence. The question of political power in Dilmun is more difficult, because archaeology often reveals structures more clearly than it reveals personalities. Names of rulers survive only in fragments of evidence, and it would be irresponsible to fill the gaps with theatrical certainty. Yet enough is known to say this much with confidence: Dilmun developed institutions capable of organizing labor, maintaining strategic sites, regulating exchange, and sustaining visible social hierarchy. This means kingship or elite authority was not incidental. It was integral. Trade on the scale evidenced at Khalid al-Bahrain and across the wider network required governance. Someone had to guarantee order. Someone had to arbitrate interests. Someone had to speak for the kingdom to foreign partners, whether through direct diplomacy or through the controlled conditions of commerce itself. And yet every system built on exchange is also vulnerable to change far beyond its own shores. The fortunes of Dilmun rose in relation to the needs of Mesopotamia, the productivity of Magan, and the capacities of maritime links to the Indus sphere. When any of these changed, Dilmun could not remain untouched. The later second millennium before the Common Era witnessed transformations across the Near East and wider Asian regions: political realignments, shifts in trade patterns, changing centers of demand, and the rise or decline of competing routes. Dilmun did not vanish in a single dramatic night. Rather, like many resilient historical societies, it changed shape. Its earlier Bronze Age brilliance softened, reconfigured, and fed into new phases of Bahrain's history under different political skies. This is where a lesser script might simply leap ahead and call the later centuries' decline, but that would miss the deeper truth. Dilmun's greatest legacy may have been its capacity for reinvention. Archaeology at Khalid al-Bahrain shows that the site remained significant through subsequent periods, including the Kassite era, later pre-imperial and imperial influences, and then the Hellenistic and post-Hellenistic phases. A place once central to Bronze Age exchange did not become irrelevant merely because the world changed around it. It remained attractive because the underlying logic of the island endured: water, position, anchorage, memory, and accumulated prestige. Civilizations rarely disappear cleanly. More often, they are absorbed into later names while continuing to shape the ground beneath them. By the time the armies and ambitions released by Alexander's conquests reached the intellectual map of the Gulf, Bahrain had entered a new chapter under a new name in Greek sources: Tylos. To modern ears, the change of name can sound like replacement, as though Dilmun and Tylos were unrelated worlds. In reality, the relationship was more layered. Greek observers and later Hellenistic powers did not discover an empty island. They encountered a place already ancient, already sacred, already integrated into regional networks, already trained in the arts of maritime mediation. What changed was the language of power, the surrounding geopolitical frame, and the forms of material culture flowing through the island. The older kingdom did not vanish, it was translated. The Louvre's presentation of Bahrain's archaeology captures this beautifully by tracing a long arc from Dilmun to Tylos. During the Dilmun Age, Bahrain was a major hub between Arabia, Iran, the Indian subcontinent, and Mesopotamia. In the Tylos period, after the era opened by Alexander, the island remained outward-looking. Tombs and grave goods from these centuries testify to continued wealth and to external influences arriving from afar. Coins, glassware, glazed pottery, and jewelry show Bahrain's integration into the Hellenistic world, while local funerary art demonstrates that integration never meant mere imitation. This is one of the most important themes in Gulf history: cosmopolitanism without self-erasure. Bahrain under Tylos engaged the Greek-speaking world, but it did so through local forms, local memories, and local priorities. One particularly striking detail preserved in classical tradition is the association of Bahrain with cotton. Ancient Greek writers, including Theophrastus, referred to the island of Tylos in connection with cotton-bearing plants and textile use. Even a detail such as this matters, because it tells us that Bahrain remained visible to outside observers not only as a waypoint, but as a place with identifiable products and character. The island was not merely on the route, it had become part of the descriptive language of the route. Once again, we see the same pattern that defined Dilmun earlier: Bahrain as a place that others had to name, describe, and account for because it mattered. To the north, Failaka too received a Hellenistic name, Ikaros, in the wake of Alexander's exploratory horizon. UNESCO's account notes that written sources associated Bahrain with Tylos and Failaka with Ikaros, showing how the islands of the Gulf were being reinscribed within a new geopolitical imagination. Yet the continuity beneath the names is revealing. Freshwater, harbors, strategic position, and sacred space still determined importance. Hellenistic fortifications and temples on Failaka did not erase the island's older role within Dilmun's distribution of settlement and exchange. Instead, they show how enduring landscapes of value can attract successive civilizational vocabularies. The Greeks named the islands endured. By the first centuries before and after the start of the Common Era, the wider Western Indian Ocean had become one of the ancient world's great theaters of movement, linking Roman Egypt, South Arabia, the Gulf, India, and the East African coast. Here, Bahrain's later history matters enormously because it demonstrates that the island remained relevant in a world now shaped by new imperial actors and longer maritime circuits. Scholarship on Western Indian Ocean trade notes that Bahrain, during the Tylos period, was strategically placed midway along the Gulf's north-south axis, endowed with water and rich in pearls, and connected through material finds to Mesopotamia, Iran, and Egypt. This does not mean Rome ruled Bahrain. It means something more subtle, and, in many ways, more revealing. Bahrain retained value precisely because it stood within a network larger than any single empire's direct grasp. The Roman world's appetite for Eastern luxuries transformed maritime patterns across the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, but the Gulf remained an active sphere of navigation and exchange. Goods, ideas, and people moved through interlocking routes rather than a single imperial pipeline. South Arabian aromatics traveled north and west. Indian textiles and spices entered wider circulation. East Africa contributed products and port communities to the system. The Gulf participated through its own nodes, of which Bahrain was among the most important. In this later age, as in the Bronze Age, the most successful places were those that could convert geography into service and service into prestige. There is a remarkable human vignette from this period in the mention of a Palmyrene acting as satrap of Tylos on behalf of the kingdom of Mesene in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Even stripped of detail, the image is extraordinary. Even nil, we do mentaless themselves a biast, even the frolopanier. Even stripped of details and resistil. Diars festa gefeste, where is terror with this terror festive, to margastes. A figure from Palmyra, that great caravan city of the Syrian desert, operating in Bahrain within a polity tied to southern Mesopotamia, in a maritime world reaching towards India and aware of Egypt. One could hardly ask for a more vivid symbol of the Gulf's connective power. Tylos was not provincial, it was relational. It drew together desert and sea, caravan and ship, Aramaic-speaking commerce and Hellenistic political forms, local authority and long-distance exchange. As later Persian powers consolidated their own interests in the Gulf, Bahrain again remained within the field of strategic concern. Scholarship notes that the Sasanians maintained a fortress at Qalat al-Bahrain. The detail matters because it confirms the island's continuing value in an age when imperial competition increasingly recognized the Gulf not as a void between civilizations, but as a zone worth controlling. A fortified Bahrain under Sasanian attention was not an afterthought. It was part of a political understanding that maritime routes, pearls, island bases, and commercial oversight formed essential components of power. The old lessons of Dilmun had not been forgotten. They had been imperialized. And so, across more than 2 millennia, the same essential pattern repeats with changing names. First Dilmun, then Tylos, later under other rulers and cultural horizons, Bahrain remained a place where the sea could be organized, where exchange could be mediated, where local resource and international demand could be brought into productive tension. This continuity should shape how we think about the broader history of the Gulf. It reminds us that Arabian societies were not intermittently important when outsiders happened to pass by. They were continuously important because they had mastered difficult environments and developed sophisticated traditions of adaptation long before many later empires ever looked in their direction. For audiences in the United Arab Emirates, this carries particular significance. Dilmun's story is not only Bahrain's story, though Bahrain stands at its center. It is part of the wider history of Eastern Arabia, the maritime intelligence of Gulf communities, the copper networks of Magan, the island and coastal linkages that made exchange possible, the movement of craftsmen, sailors, and merchants across waters that outsiders sometimes imagined as barriers but which local peoples understood as connective tissue. The ancient Gulf was already a civilizational conversation. Its participants did not require permission from Mesopotamia, Persia, or the Mediterranean to become historical actors. They were actors from the beginning. This is also why Dilmun offers such a fresh and compelling subject even after many videos about lost cities, desert routes, and vanished settlements. Dilmun was not simply lost. It was remembered too strongly to be lost completely. Its challenge is different. It survives in layers in myth, in burial landscapes, in seals, in walls, in temple foundations, in the memory of water, in later names, and in the continuing identity of the Gulf as a meeting place of continents. The fascination lies not in disappearance alone, but in transformation. Dilmun asks us to follow how a Bronze Age kingdom could become a permanent habit of place, how memory can settle into geography so deeply that even political change cannot dislodge it. When we imagine the harbor of ancient Dilmun at dusk, we should resist the temptation to fill it only with grandeur. Grandeur there was, certainly foreign cargoes, official storehouses, ceremonial spaces, elite burials, international renown. But there was also waiting. Waiting for cargoes to arrive, waiting for winds to turn. Waiting for water to be drawn, for accounts to be balanced, for rituals to be performed, for the dead to be honored, for distant partners to keep their word. That waiting is one of the truest signs of civilization because it reveals trust stretched across time. A society that can wait well is a society confident that its institutions, its gods, and its relationships will hold. Dilmun waited, received, measured, buried, blessed, and endured. There is a profound dignity in that endurance. The mounds on Bahrain are not only monuments to loss, they are monuments to confidence. The temples are not only ruins, they are evidence that people believed sacred order could inhabit an island world. The seals are not only administrative tools, they are miniature declarations that identity itself can be negotiated across cultures. The walls at Khalat al-Bahrain are not only remnants of defense, they are proof that a harbor city in the Gulf expected history to come to its gates and prepared accordingly. And the later name Tylos is not merely an overlay of foreign language. It is a reminder that powerful places compel each era to rename them in its own tongue, even while the place itself remains more ancient than the words used to describe it. Seen in this light, Dilmun becomes more than an archaeological subject. It becomes a meditation on what makes a place central, not size alone, not military conquest alone, not wealth alone. Centrality can arise from mediation, from reliability, from ecological intelligence, from the ability to convert geography into relationship and relationship into continuity. Dilmun did this with brilliance. It stood between river and ocean, between copper and grain, between Mesopotamian text and Arabian seafaring practice, between the sacred language of paradise and the hard discipline of exchange. It connected the Indus world to Western Asia long before later globalizations would claim to have invented interconnection. It helped shape the Gulf into one of the oldest continuously meaningful maritime regions on Earth. And perhaps that is the deepest reason the story still speaks so strongly today. In the modern Gulf, people know that coastlines are not merely scenic edges of nations. They are generators of identity, commerce, diplomacy, and memory. They know that prosperity in this region has always required vision, organization, and resilience in the face of an often severe environment. They know that water, ports, and trust remain fundamental. In this sense, Dilmun does not belong only to the remote past. It belongs to a longer Arabian inheritance, the understanding that a society can be both rooted and open, both local and international, both practical and aspirational. That balance is ancient here. It did not arrive yesterday. When we call Dilmun the lost kingdom of paradise, we should hear the phrase properly. Lost because its rulers are mostly silent and its language of power survives in fragments. Paradise because ancient peoples recognized in it an unusual conjunction of water, order, abundance, and sanctity. Kingdom because archaeology leaves no doubt that this was not a simple port of convenience, but a society capable of shaping landscapes, organizing labor, and projecting prestige across the Gulf. And if we listen carefully, beneath those words lies an even more powerful truth. Dilmun was never merely a destination. It was an idea made real that in a harsh world, civilization could be built not in spite of the sea, but through it. At the end of its long historical arc, Dilmun leaves us not with a single dramatic fall, but with a subtler and more haunting legacy. It teaches that some civilizations do not disappear into oblivion. They dissolve into the foundations of everything that follows. The ships change, the languages change, the empires change, the names change from Dilmun to Tylos and beyond, yet the old logic remains. The Gulf continues to reward those who understand movement, mediation, and the moral seriousness of hospitality. The Arabian coast continues to produce societies able to speak with multiple worlds at once. And the buried mounds of Bahrain still rise from the earth like a patient answer to anyone who doubts that this region stood at the center of ancient history. If one were to stand there at first light, with the sea wind moving softly and the land still cool from night, one might begin to understand why Mesopotamian memory elevated this place beyond mere geography, not because it was unreal, but because it was so improbable and yet so enduring, an island kingdom of fresh water and maritime wealth, a sanctuary of trade and tombs, a bridge between the river cities of Iraq, the copper shores of Magan, the merchants of the Indus, the imperial gaze of Persia, the commercial imagination of the Hellenistic world, the markets linked to Rome, and the oceanic circuits that reached towards East Africa and India. Dilmun was not the edge of civilization. It was one of the places where civilization learned to travel. And that, in the end, is why its story deserves to be told slowly, with respect, and with a measure of wonder. For Dilmun was not simply a kingdom that vanished. It was a kingdom that taught the ancient world how to connect. It proved that islands could govern exchange, that water could confer sanctity, that memory could outlive dynasties, and that the Arabian Gulf was not a silent backdrop to history, but one of its oldest and most eloquent voices. Long after the merchants were gone, long after the seals had lost their owners, long after foreign powers had renamed the harbors, the land itself continued to speak. In its temples, in its graves, in its stratified city, and in the enduring rhythm of the sea, Dilmun still speaks now.